This slide deck will examine how to build, evaluate, and fund prevention strategies that impact multiple outcomes in injury and violence. Specifically, we are going to look at how we design prevention strategies that impact multiple outcomes, how we evaluate prevention strategies that impact multiple outcomes, and how we fund prevention strategies that impact multiple outcomes. It's important to remember that we have the biggest impact on prevention when we are focusing on upstream strategies, developing strategies that aim to positively impact the social drivers of health, acknowledging and understanding the systems of power impacting the population we are working with, and creating strategies in a collaborative, inclusive manner that acknowledges the impacts of trauma on the population. So, what does an IVP strategy look like, and how can you build one? In the last section, we learned that we can prevent injuries and violence through a public health approach. And that to have the biggest impact, this approach must take into account the shared risk and protective factors that are impacting your outcome. To design prevention strategies that impact multiple outcomes, there are many factors that should be taken into consideration. Let's look at some questions and tools that might help guide the process. Before you start defining your prevention strategy, it is important to understand how social and political will currently exist in the community or population you are working with. This allows us to better understand what needs to happen to change the landscape. Included on this slide are questions worth asking while defining your strategy. Of course, to fully understand the population you are looking to impact, they must be included in the planning. Included on this slide are 7 tips on engaging with all types of partners. There are many tools and resources that can help you with building out your prevention strategy. Tools, like the ones outlined on this slide, are helpful for thinking through your complex prevention strategies. Outlining how you are going to impact multiple outcomes can best be accomplished through a theory of change model. But what exactly does this look like? Let's examine. A theory of change is a written or visual description of how and why a set of actions and conditions will lead to certain outcomes. It can be used to plan, evaluate, and make decisions about social change. Therefore, it is often used as the guiding plan for complex IVP strategies. The most useful theory of change models brings together existing evidence and resources related to a program or strategy. It can help identify gaps in evidence or resources related to a program or strategy, as well as clarify where there are agreements and disagreements about the program or strategy. Included on this slide is examples of the inputs needed to help build out your theory of change model. As mentioned before, many of these pieces of information may already have been captured during the planning process. A theory of change can look different from organization to organization. Shown here is one example from Springboard Opportunities. Once you have a prevention strategy in place, you will want to ensure you have a strong evaluation plan in place as well. IVP strategies looking to improve multiple outcomes are inherently complex. Provided on this slide are some key points that might help you during your evaluation planning. First, make sure you engage partners early and in every step of planning and implementing your evaluation. Confirm that your SRPF approach is logical and well-designed to set you up for success. Some things to consider during this process include making sure you have an appropriate theory of change or logical model laid out. Consider having SMART objectives tied to your strategy and that the project description is well defined. Be sure to clarify the purpose of your evaluation. Consider an elevator speech of what partners hope to achieve through their evaluation efforts. What kind of evaluation will you use to achieve this process, impact, formative outcome? Be strategic about the outcomes you include in your evaluation. Use existing evidence to select outcomes that are most strongly attributable to your SRPF approach. Start small and build. Defining the scope of your evaluation is necessary to understand the time, human, and financial resources you will need to complete the project, as well as ensure you stay within any budget or time limits that have been set already. An evaluation plan is a written document that describes how you will monitor and evaluate your strategy, as well as how you intend to use evaluation results for program improvement and decision-making. The evaluation plan clarifies how you will describe the what, the how, and the why it matters for your program. The next few slides outline this process in detail. Step 1 of your evaluation plan includes providing the background of the project. This background should include a summary of the strategy, the priority shared risk and protective factors to be addressed, the expected outcomes from this strategy, the population this strategy is looking to impact, and the location where this strategy is taking place. Step 2 of your evaluation plan should provide a more detailed description of the strategy. Included in this should be a theory of change model that illustrates how SRPF factors are expected to impact public health issues. Step 3 includes defining stakeholders and ensuring buy-in. Identifying stakeholders is essential to guiding your program development and evaluation. Stakeholders should be across sectors and disciplines. When identifying stakeholders, ask yourself, what value will they bring? What is their reach? What are their priorities in this work? Many of the IVP tools outlined in previous slides are helpful in this process. It isn't feasible to evaluate everything in our theory of change model, so defining the scope of the evaluation becomes essential before data collection starts. The evaluation scope specifically outlines 1. The uses of the evaluation results, and 2. The evaluation purpose. This can often be done by thinking backward. Let's look more closely at how this is done with the next slide. Defining the scope is best done by working backward. Start by thinking through the ultimate purpose of your initiative and the evaluation. Then, use that information to help you determine the scope. What is the overall impact you are looking for? An example might be connectedness among youth in your community. What do we need to know to show this impact? What does community connectedness among youth look like? Is it a mentoring program? Green space? Adult involvement? Fewer rates of youth suicide? Who can help collect this information? Is it a community center? Is it state surveillance? What data sources do we collectively have? Surveys, BRFS data? Do the strategies we have outlined in our theory of change correspond to this information? Does this match what we said we were going to do? Step 5 is putting together the full data collection plan. The data collection plan lays out key process and outcome data needed for the evaluation. Some of this information has already been collected throughout your evaluation and program planning. Information to include in your data collection plan includes evaluation questions, indicators you are using, data collection method, data collection frequency, responsibility, and timeline. Finally, Step 6, communicating and sharing your evaluation results. This step is essential for ensuring ongoing support for the program and contributing to the knowledge base that continues to drive the field forward. A well-laid-out evaluation plan should include clear assumptions. Being clear about the assumptions underlying a program can often help develop evaluation questions. Examples might be acknowledging and thinking about things like how long stable funding is available, if there are qualified program staff available, if the program strategies are culturally appropriate for the identified audience, and if the program has a champion and/or sustainable support from the community. Evaluative planning and thinking should be used in all program development stages. Review, revise, evaluate. Included on this slide are questions to consider throughout your planning process that can be implemented into your evaluation plan. Now that we have an idea of what an evaluation plan looks like, you might be asking yourself, what should we be measuring? Let's look at this a little more closely. A formative evaluation has us looking at data that shows us how much we did and how well we did it. This can be done through methods such as attendance data, needs assessments, process evaluations, evaluability assessments, and more. This slide shows an example of formative evaluation data for an IVP program focused on increasing community connectedness to impact youth safety. A summative evaluation has us looking at data that shows us if anyone is better off. This can be done with methods such as outcome evaluation surveys, impact evaluation surveys, community records, public, state/community data, and more. This slide shows an example of summative evaluation data for an IVP program focused on increasing community connectedness to impact youth safety. Both your formative evaluation data and your summative evaluation data should feed into your overall evaluation plan. Now that we have strategies and evaluations in place, it is time to think about how we can fund IVP strategies that impact multiple outcomes. IVP strategies that impact multiple outcomes lend themselves well to braiding and layering funds, since they span multiple program areas and ultimately work to positively impact the social drivers of health. Braiding, blending, and layering refer to coordinating two or more funds to achieve a standard set of goals. This type of funding allows prevention programs to implement cross-cutting initiatives, like SRPF approaches, while achieving the goals outlined in grants and cooperative agreements. The terms blended, braided, and layered are often used together and usually with little definition between the three. It's also common to see them used in conjunction with each other. Blending of funding involves merging the funds in one source. When funding is blended, it goes into a pot. With blended funding, there is no means for the financial manager to report which funding source paid for what expense. To blend your funding, you must work closely with your funders to ensure you can meet their reporting requirements. It is important to keep in mind. Some funding sources cannot be blended based on funding requirements. Reporting involves describing how the collective funds are being used. The benefit of this approach is that blending funding can be less challenging to administer. However, because there is less detail about how funds have been spent, you have to have clear ongoing communication with your funders, partners, and program staff. Braided funding involves multiple funding sources with careful accounting of how every dollar from each funding source is spent. The term braiding is used because multiple, initially separate funding sources are brought together to pay for more than any one funding source can support. These funds are then carefully identified so the program can report to funders how the money was spent. Things to consider with this approach. funding sources only pay for things directly associated with the intent of the funding. It's usually used with federal funding because they require careful tracking. Tracking systems need to be fairly detailed. You have to know what the funding source can and can't pay for. Development is usually based on the funding specifications rather than the public health needs. Layered funding includes different layers: the foundational layer, which allows a program to operate, and additional layers, which fill in the gaps. With layered funding, there is usually a substantial foundational layer, which allows operation. You can take out a source and still have the program function, unlike braided funding. The principle with layered funding is to supplement, not supplant. Think of building blocks. When using a blended, braided or layered funding approach, it is important to set up a clear funding coordination process to ensure that you are meeting grant requirements, partner needs, and administrative processes properly. The following slides outline the steps for funding coordination, with a corresponding slide giving an example of what this might look like. Step 1 encourages you to define your vision for how the funding will be used. Much of this information may come from your theory of change model, or even your evaluation plan. Things to consider when defining your vision include: what risk or protective factors you are trying to impact. What outcomes/key performance indicators, KPIs, must you achieve? What does your program currently look like? Consider leveraging existing initiatives with some resources or infrastructure already in place. What is the length of time this would be implemented? Are you prepared to let go of less impactful program interventions in order to leverage braided funding initiatives? What infrastructure is needed to support this work? What programs and people do you need to pull in? What administrative infrastructure is needed to support this work? This slide presents an example of a vision for funding a prevention strategy focused on building community coordination of resources. Outlined are the two funding streams being blended together, who the funding is available through, how the funding will be managed, how it will be reported, and its role in the IVP strategy. Step 2 encourages you to identify partners for this coordinated funding. Partners you may want to consider include funders, leadership, administrators, budget coordinators, programmatic staff, data personnel, and external partners. Here are the partners identified for our example used in the previous slide. Each of these individuals could play a role in strategy we are building a coordinated funding plan for. The level of the SEM we are focused on is also identified. Both of these are important for understanding who the funding might be going to, as well as who will play a role within this strategy. Step 3 includes identifying funding streams and developing your coordinated financing plan. Developing your coordinated financing plan is where the pen meets the paper. While all financing plans look different, listed on this slide are steps you can take to get started. You can start by listing the funding sources you believe would serve your population or risk/protective factors of interest. Some of the funding sources you will have access to already, while others may be external funding sources that organizations in your community or at the state level. Explore gaps in funding as it relates to your vision. What/who is each funding stream serving? Where do the gaps occur? Where are there overlaps? Do you have a clear understanding of what each funding source could fund to carry out your vision and SRPF approach? Analyze funding streams. Once you have an idea of the funding streams you want to pursue to build your coordinated financing plan, take time to explore the allowable and non-allowable costs for each funding source. Collect information and discuss allowable expenses, documentation of expenses, and reporting requirements. This may include meeting with your funders to ask questions, doing background research, or downloading fiscal guidance from funders' websites. Finalize your coordinated financing plan. If you have completed the steps above, much of a coordinated plan is already taking shape. A completed financing plan will increase everyone's confidence that funding is being used appropriately. A coordinated financing plan helps apply cost allocation and collaborative budgeting. Some technical features of a coordinated financing plan include the budget for the approach, how cost sharing will be carried out, the tracking and reporting systems that will be used for finances, as well as programmatic evaluation. The following slide outlines a very basic funding plan for our IVP strategy focused on building community coordination of resources. Outlined are the resources each funding provides, as well as the outcomes we hope to impact with this work. Step 4 of developing your coordinated funding plan includes implementing, tracking, and improving. For implementing, tracking, and improving, it is important to remember that regular communication is key. Establish ongoing communications and maintain relationships with leadership and funders. Communicate about changes and updates to the project as soon as possible. Train staff and develop procedures for new staff to ensure a common vision and understanding. Consider ways to incorporate a quality improvement process into this work. It is important to remember that braiding and layering are not mechanisms for commingling funds. Detailed budgeting and reporting processes should be used to ensure accountability. Things you might be saying to yourself: this is more work. This is why your vision is so important. If you align your funding with goals you have already set, you should be on your way. My grant requires funding evidence-based interventions only, and doesn't allow innovation. The interventions will still be there, but the way we fund and talk about their impact will look different. This doesn't impact me. This type of approach involves the whole team. If you work in administration, ensure the inclusion of braiding, layering, and allocation language. If you work in surveillance, help find the data that builds support for the vision and goals. If you are programmatic, be on the lookout for commonalities and shared upstream links between your programs and others. How do I even start this? Consider starting small. Find programs, grants, and interventions that have common elements or overlap, and expand over time. Grants are so rigid. Use your voice and advocate for more funding flexibility. Advocate for business processes that ensure accountability but provide the necessary flexibility to implement the initiative. Finally, set the tone for others, too. If you are developing a grant opportunity, ensure the inclusion of braiding, layering, and allocation language. Share your story with others so we can have more concrete examples. You are an example.